There's something about dungeons that is just so purely role-playing game. Whether it's because they started the craze with Dungeons and Dragons, or because there's just a natural human urge to explore dark, cavernous spaces and look for wonderful treasures within, it's clear to tell us that dungeons are great, but your dungeons really do need one thing, and your dungeons need to live. Hello everyone, I am Kyle Ott, I am the Dork, you're watching Desks and Dorks. Couple things. One, if you'd like to show us some love and support, please make sure that you like, share, comment, subscribe. It really does help us out. If you would like to really support us, you can get our games in the links below. And one last thing, I sound like I have smoked about like 900 packs of cigarettes. I just got back from Gen Con, and as a result of that fact, I sound like the slug woman from Monsters, Inc. I'm always watching, Wazowski. Always watching. But in any case, we're back and here we are. So with that being said, let's talk about how to make your dungeons live. So the first thing that you need to do is when you're building your dungeons, you should give your creatures what I like to call an ecosystem. Remember, your monsters, your creatures, whatever, are living beings, and as a result of that, they're going to exist as a part of a greater system. Let's talk exactly what I mean when I say ecosystem, though, because there are three big things that I think go into making a believable monster ecosystem, and one that's going to make your dungeons feel like living organisms. One is patterns of movement, two is discernible goals based on biology, and then three is an impact based on their presence or their absence. For this example, let's talk about our good pal. This is Steve. Everybody say hi, Steve. Steve is horrifying. Steve is the stuff of nightmares. Steve is a giant omnivorous cave slug, and Steve inhabits a dungeon. We're going to call this dungeon for the remainder of the video Steve's Land. This is Steve's Land, and that's in fact where our players are going to find themselves. Now the first thing we have to talk about is a pattern of movement. Right up here in the top corner by the red X is Steve's nest. This is where Steve ostensibly sleeps, or if Steve is one of those species of insect that does not require a mate to live for very long in order to produce offspring, this could be where Steve goes to hatch his offspring. Now, when we talk about patterns of movement, it's important to consider the environment of the dungeon itself. So when I think of Steve, right, Steve is a giant worm-like creature, which means that Steve has the ability to crawl on ceilings and walls. Dope. And B, because of that, probably wants to corral his prey in areas that would be hard to run from. And as a result of that, Steve's movement is restrained to the areas of the staircase that he gets particularly close to. This means that Steve can make use of the walls and ceilings in those stairwells to pick off unsuspecting or unprepared prey. Then drag it back. Sorry, folks. Again, my voice at Gen Con shot, so you'll have to bear with me for this video, but I wanted to get it out because I actually really do love the idea of a living dungeon. So Steve spends most of their time patrolling this little loop by these stairs and dragging back any poor unfortunate soul right back to their lair. Now, what happens when we talk about Steve's discernible goal? Steve wants food. Steve is not an intelligent being, and by intelligent I mean sentient, right? Steve is not capable of higher thought. Steve is essentially a bundle of giant nerves wrapped inside of carapace, and those nerves are hungry. And so Steve wants food. Particularly though, of the food that Steve wants easy to pick off prey, and that looks like goblins, who also inhabit part of the dungeon, which gets me to our last point. What happens when Steve is gone? Let's say your players have gone into Steve's Land and have met the aforementioned Steve, taking him out in the process. What happens to the dungeon? Well, this is what happens to the dungeon. The goblins that have been hiding in the other half of the dungeon, or might have just been hiding in the land outside of the dungeon, are now free to move in, because now they are able to do so without fear of being picked off and devoured by Steve. The area that was Steve's nest has now been transformed, you can tell by my little blue dots, into essentially a pen or a jail cell for people that the tribe captures and are going to use as either hostages or as food sources later on down the road. So how else can you make your dungeon feel like a living organism, a living part of your world, to help you draw in that all-important player buy-in? Well, you need to do is you need to make sure that your dungeon does not feel like it exists independent from the game world that you have established. And the best way to do this is to connect it to things like, in this instance, a fantasy war or other larger, more important or impactful events that happen in your game world alongside the dungeon. Let's consider that one of the big impacts of war is that it generally tends to displace a lot of people. This is true both in our world and in fantasy worlds, and it's an impact that many times I feel like a lot of dungeon masters or game masters do not take into account. There's a ton of people that need to be relocated during a wartime, and what is a dungeon if not a large space, a space that in many cases is free from the elements? So going back to the example of Steve's Land, we're going to say that right there in the center of this dungeon, close to the entrance, is where a group of refugees have taken up residence, which means that depending on the status of Steve's Land, there's going to be a number of things that happen. If the goblins are still in Steve's Land, it means that several of them, and by them I mean the people who have had to flee, the refugees, are now captured by those goblins. The goblins are going to either A, use them as food, or B, use them as hostages. But again, those people are now in danger because they have decided to use this as a spot. This means that there's tons of opportunities for questing. The players could perhaps get in touch with the refugee community and, maybe be recruited to go rescue their friends. They might stumble on them by accident. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that you could cook up. But unfortunately, it gets a lot worse for our buddies if Steve is still around, because it means that instead of being captured and potentially being able to be rescued, those individuals have already been consumed by Steve. This means that what becomes a mission of rescue in the case of the goblins is now a mission of revenge. And lastly, but certainly not least, your dungeon is not unchanging. Going back to Steve's Land, let's say that the players have already cleared out everything in the dungeon. The goblins are gone, the refugees have been rescued, Steve is unfortunately no longer with us, and that means that now there is a large cavernous space. So what do human beings do when they are presented with opportunity? Regardless of whether that opportunity is dangerous, they move in. I have decided to select this merchant guild to show you a little bit. Let's say an upstart merchant guild has now formed in the city. They have made some powerful enemies, but they're also flush with cash. And what do they need? A base of operations. And what better place than a defensible underground fortress from which to carry out their mercantile endeavors? That purple line is actually where the main part of the merchant's headquarters are. Those dots are where the merchants have set up small guard posts, and this fledgling merchant guild now takes up residence in this dungeon, which again, thanks to the work of your players, no longer has a giant omnivorous insect abomination or a tribe of goblins to deal with, and that is kind of exciting. And again, it makes it so that your dungeon is not just this place removed from the world that you have created, but instead is a living, breathing part of it, that also has living parts within it. I think this is the best way in order to do this, and the best way to make your dungeons feel like they are alive. And truthfully, that is the coolest way to do this, and I think it's going to get a ton of extra buy-in from your players and some extra enjoyment as well. Well, folks, I hope that you all enjoy this. I really do appreciate it, and yeah, thank you again to everybody who watched, and thank you again to everybody who continues to like, share, comment, and subscribe. It really does mean a lot. Apologies again about my voice. I am hopefully going to continue to try to rest it, or at least try to rest it for as long as I can, but you boys got to keep making stuff. So in any case, thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.